Well, welcome back, U.S. History. Here we are for the fifth and final installment of the Teddy Roosevelt Lecture Series. Some of you are probably like, whoa, thank God that this is wrapping up. And others, I've actually had a lot of really good comments where I can tell some of you are paying really close attention and digging this whole story and doing a biography. I know people are all across the spectrum on that, and some of you are probably like, whatever, we're covering history stuff either way. I'll just go with the flow. Hopefully you like the biography series. I like to tie in now. It's not that Teddy Roosevelt is the most important man ever in American history or from this era and, everything came down to him. But I like looking at personal stories and tying in their personal story to a lot of different things that were happening in history. To me, I think it just makes it more interesting and you can understand kind of what was going on, the context of the times, by knowing one person's story that you can kind of identify with as another human being, an individual. So we'll probably be doing some more of these throughout the year. Generally, the Roosevelt one, like I said, I think he's probably my overall most interesting American, one of my, I think, most interesting people in all of history. So I go very in depth on him. But I plan to do some other biographies like this. But most of the time, just to kind of give you a ballpark guess, it'll probably be a 1 to 3 part like series. So this one drags on a little bit, but hey, Teddy Roosevelt was an interesting guy because he did a lot of stuff and impacted America in a big way. Now, where we left off last time was him being president and what he had done to impact the country. And we got into some specifics. So the last slide where we left off, I was hitting a bunch of different pictures and images and political cartoons as stuff he was doing. Now, we're going to move into post-presidency here in just a second. But the last thing I want to hit on for while he was president was Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. Now, this is totally a foreign policy thing, not something like making national parks or signing in the Meat Inspection Act. Those were things that affected Americans inside the country. But Roosevelt had a profound impact on American foreign policy, too. And honestly, his foreign policy matters a whole lot more than the presidents of the 100 years before him, because now America is starting to build an empire. And that happened right before Roosevelt became president. So think about that. Like, you go back to 1800 on through to 1850, 1860, 70, 80, 90. Like, that's the kind of Washington to Lincoln era. America was a big country, but it was expanding across the continent. We weren't really looking to create problems around the world, or maybe not problems, that's the wrong way to say it. We weren't looking to take more territory around the world because we were trying to get out to the Pacific coast. We were essentially trying to conquer the land we already owned as territories. It was the Wild West and cowboys and Indians, and there were all kinds of adventures to be had, and we were trying to civilize that part of the continent. So we had been very preoccupied with the American West, and it was really in Roosevelt's lifetime when the West essentially was closed and all of that had been kind of settled, and it wasn't the Wild West anymore, and there were no Indian tribes roaming free. Roosevelt now, this is something that you would want to put in about him. He very much believed Americans needed challenges. He subscribed to the idea that a term he used a lot was rugged individualism. He very much believed in that. So I'd write that down, rugged individualism. And that was his image of the stereotypical American, that Americans are tough and we want to go fight and we need challenges and we got to conquer things and we got mountains we got to climb and obstacles to overcome. Okay. He believed that and he practiced what he preached, going out and being a cowboy, going and fighting in the Spanish-American War. And he thought all true Americans, that's the essence of what it is to be an American. He was very much worried that with the West closing and, there not being that frontier anymore, that Americans were going to get fat, lazy, and complacent, that we were going to get soft and weak if we didn't have challenges, internally in the country. So, as he fought in the Spanish-American War before he was president, and then once he becomes president, just a few years after that, he wants to start applying that. Now the West is closed. He wants to start looking abroad for challenges. He feels like now it's time for America to really beef up its military and to go start taking other colonies. He would have been in the imperialist group. That was a controversial thing, whether America should take colonies or not. I had talked about that in some of the other notes. Well, he was firmly in the imperialist camp at this stage of his life during his presidency. So he puts into effect what he calls, or he nicknames, big stick diplomacy. You should write that down. You should have some notes on it. The ones that we had done, I think, on Monday in class that'll be coming up on a quiz and the test. So big stick diplomacy, where does that come from? That's kind of a funny sounding term, big stick. It actually, Roosevelt went on many hunting safaris in his lifetime, several of them to Africa. And this comes from an old African proverb where the proverb goes, speak softly and carry a big stick and you will go far, okay? What that means, what it's saying is that you don't want to go around running your mouth all the time and constantly talking trash. Don't be that guy that's yap, 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 and I'll fight you and you better do this and that. But when you do say something, your words should have meaning. So you speak softly, but you carry a big stick. Essentially saying you tell people, what your goals, expectations, you lay down the law, and if they cross you, you whack them with the stick. All right? That's kind of what it means. So it comes from that old African proverb. Now, for what I would want you to write in your notes and really know about it. Essentially, what big stick diplomacy means is that you're going to use your military to get what you want. Your military, specifically in Roosevelt's case with big stick diplomacy, is talking about the Navy. That the Navy, American Navy, we had a lot of pride in that. Only the British at the time had a better Navy than us. The Navy is the metaphor, like that's the big stick that you would club people with if they get out of line and they're not doing what you want. Roosevelt actually enforced the Monroe Doctrine on a few occasions. And he got like the Panama Canal built, which I'm going to come back to that pretty soon. But you have North America and South America in this thin little strip of land that connects them. Well, we have a big Navy, but say a war broke out, like during the Spanish-American War, and our fleet is divided into two halves. Half of our Navy in the Atlantic, half in the Pacific. Well, if there's an emergency and we get into a big fight, if you take the second best Navy in the world and divide it into two halves, is it really the second best Navy? Or now is it like, some fraction of that? So to sail all the way around South America to link our fleet up, it would take about 3 weeks with the ships of the time. But once we dug that canal in between North America and South America, now we could cut in between the continents with the Panama Canal. Now you could link your fleet up in about a week. So Roosevelt, he took a lot of flack and criticism for this because he basically caused a revolution in South America to get this canal built. The government down there at the time had said, no, we don't want you Americans coming in and digging a canal. So Roosevelt, not to take no for an answer, he uses his big stick diplomacy and he essentially sends the Navy down there, funds a revolution, and then the new government that owes him a favor now because he helps this rebel group take control of the country of Panama and break away from Colombia. Now they let us dig the canal. So with big stick diplomacy, he did a lot of good things and accomplished a lot for America in a lot of different ways. But it was also kind of controversial because it's like, man, maybe we should be negotiating with people and treating other people like as equals rather than just going around and whacking people and taking what we want. But you know what I mean? I don't know. That's for you guys to decide on that and America and the rest of us throughout history. All right, moving on past big stick diplomacy. Now, the presidents after him start tweaking it. It's not like big stick diplomacy stays around forever. His successor, who I'm going to start talking about right now, Taft, uses dollar diplomacy. Basically, the concept is there that you're going to spend money to get what you want. Then the guy after him is Woodrow Wilson. He uses moral diplomacy, where it's like he tries to, whether he really meant this or not, but he always tries to spin it as like we're going to do morally the right thing. All right, can you get it? So you should have those in your notes, and they were part of what we had covered on Monday too. Oh, went too far past that. Okay, so Roosevelt is done with the presidency now. He's basically served 2 terms. Remember, McKinley gets assassinated. So about a year into McKinley's second term, he dies and Roosevelt takes over because he was vice president. Roosevelt made one of the biggest mistakes of his life, apparently, according to sources that knew him well, right after he gets sworn in as president. He apparently said, now there was no law at the time that said presidents could only have 2 terms, but George Washington, our first president and one of the most respected ones, he could have essentially been king of the country if he wanted to. But with all due respect to George Washington, or giving him a lot of respect, he said, no, I'm going to do 2 terms as president. That's enough for anybody. And then I'm going to go back to my farm and let somebody else take over. I don't want to be king. We just fought a war against the British so we wouldn't have a king. All right. So every president after that had followed that precedent of 2 terms, and that's it. Roosevelt came in and had almost 2 terms, but was a year short. Anyway, when he became president, initially he said, I'm only going to run for re-election one more time, and once I get that, I basically have had 2 terms, and just like George Washington, I'm going to bow out and not run. Well, by the end of his second term as president in 1908, he's been president 7 years, and he was not ready to give up the job. And he regretted it so much. He wanted to, and legally absolutely could have. There was no rule against that. He could have run another term. And essentially, he didn't get elected twice. He got elected once. So he even could have spun it in a way that, yeah, every president should get elected to 2. And, the first one, I was just filling in for McKinley, who passed away. Anyway, though, Roosevelt, this is something I respect about him, was a man of his word. And he felt like, even though I don't want to do this now, and I can come up with a whole list of reasons why I should run for president again, and he was quite popular. He would have gotten elected, I think, no problem. He decides to be a man of his word, and he is going to resign. That kind of killed him. But he's still young. He was the youngest president we've ever had, all right? So he still feels like he's got a lot of life ahead of him. He's going to go take on other adventures. Immediately after leaving the presidency, he decides he's going to go on a hunting safari in Africa. The guy that he actually kind of hand selects to be his replacement, I'm going to shrink my image down here, is William Taft. He is he's very different from Teddy Roosevelt. You can see just probably by looking at him, he's one of the most heavy-set presidents we've ever had. Maybe that picture doesn't do it justice. If you ever heard the story about a president that got stuck in the White House bathtub, it was that guy. So anyway, they put in a bigger bathtub later on. Taft, and Roosevelt had been best buddies. Best friends. Taft had been the Secretary of War, the Secretary of Defense. They got along on most things. They saw eye to eye. Now, personality-wise, they're totally different. Roosevelt is a ball of energy. He's ADHD. He's always bouncing from one thing to another. He's outspoken. He's not afraid of a fight and controversy. Personality-wise, Taft was totally different. Now, Roosevelt thought Taft was going to run the country kind of how Roosevelt had been running it, but when he actually gets into office, that's not really the case. Taft kind of goes back to the old school way of doing things. He's not as hands-on as Roosevelt. He doesn't have nearly as much energy. He doesn't like controversy and fighting with people. He kind of reverts back to the old way like McKinley had been running stuff, where he's not necessarily openly corrupt himself, but he allows corruption to kind of come back in and people to take bribes. He doesn't really hold the people that work for him accountable. He doesn't use the presidency like a bully pulpit. Like I said, Roosevelt would go around and, he would get after people and use the power of the presidency to make things happen in the country. Taft is way more laid back. All right. But for the first year of Taft's presidency, Roosevelt is totally checked out. He goes on, it's like a 10 or 11 month hunting safari in East Africa, where he kills every animal you could possibly imagine. He shoot, and I've got a bunch of pictures there, and he went and traveled with different tribes and stuff, the Maasai warriors that were renowned lion hunters. He shoots rhinos and elephants, and the one that got cut off right here, he's got a leopard. Now you might say, hey, Roosevelt, I thought he was all about preserving nature. He made the first national parks. He wanted to conserve things and keep nature pristine. Why the heck is he out there shooting all these endangered species? Well, for one, this is 1908, 1909 that we're talking about. None of those species that you're seeing right there were endangered at the time. Their numbers were all way up. This is well over 100 years ago. Next up, Roosevelt definitely he would not have approved of hunting any species to extinction. So he wanted to just go out and do these hunts and he always wanted to have fair hunts too. Remember the story about the bear where it was chained up and they were going to have him shoot it. And he was like, that's not a fair hunt. Let that bear go. I want fair hunts. I want to have a challenge. So I think in fairness, he did go out and actually do the hunting and the hard work and the hiking and the tracking. But a lot of people didn't like that he was shooting all these animals either. If you ever go look it up, I don't have the numbers handy in my head, but it's a crazy amount of animals that were killed. And he took a lot of flack for that. People are like, Roosevelt, you're bloodthirsty. You're just out there murdering animals, you cruel jerk. He responded to that and said, you know what? Every single animal we killed, and this is actually true, was either eaten by his hunting party or donated to local tribes. So not one like ounce of meat supposedly went to waste. It all got used by the people they were hunting with and the local people that were quite poor in a lot of these regions. Or many of the animals got stuffed by a taxidermist and were sent back to Washington, D.C., and actually many of them are still on display today at the Smithsonian Museum. So if you're going on the D.C. trip, you can go through. That's like one of my favorite parts of the whole trip. That probably is my favorite thing, is the Natural History Museum. And man, there's a lot of Roosevelt stuff there and a lot of animals that he actually personally shot and got stuffed. So, all right. He is a conservationist. He's kind of a man of contradictions in a lot of way, but he's also a hunter and he wants to like go use nature. Well, when he comes back from the hunting trip, all right, this almost year-long safari, remember, like, he wasn't checking Twitter. He wasn't, he had no TV, no radio. He's out in Africa of 1908, 1909. News didn't really get out there to him to get all the latest political updates as to what was happening in America. So when he finally does get tuned back in, he actually goes the roundabout way and goes through Europe. He meets some kings and queens, travels all over, and he starts getting being able to read newspapers again because he's back kind of in civilization. And he realizes that Taft was not running the country how he wanted him to run the country, that Taft was not being that progressive. He wasn't running the country how in a Roosevelt-approved way. So Roosevelt starts becoming very critical of Taft. He starts dogging him. These two guys who had once been best friends, they basically become political worst enemies. Roosevelt hates that this guy isn't doing it like he thought he was going to do it, and he can't let that go. So Roosevelt says, he basically kind of backtracks. He said, I wouldn't run any more than these 2 terms together if they were consecutive. But now we're getting close to like another presidential cycle. So this is actually a couple years go by where they're just like kind of fighting with each other and stuff. And he says, I'm going to run again because they're not consecutive terms. So I'm not breaking my word. I'm not lying, but I am going to go do another term because for 1, the law says I can. For 2, the country needs me. For 3, they're not consecutive terms. So that doesn't count. All right. So the next party, like Roosevelt actually tries to take the Republican nomination from Taft at the party's political convention. All right. Now, the people overwhelmingly wanted Roosevelt. Roosevelt got way, way, way more votes in all the primaries. But political parties are private organizations. They don't have to just give it to whoever gets the most votes. That might surprise some of you, but that's not how the political parties actually work. They can do some really shady stuff. And remember, the political bosses, the guys that like ran the party like behind the scenes and were kind of controlling a lot of the state delegations, they hated Roosevelt because he wouldn't listen to them. He wouldn't do what they wanted him to do. And he was all about weeding out corruption and kind of ruining the good thing that they had going. Taft, on the other hand, was pretty easy to work with. He basically did what the party bosses said. So the party bosses figured out a way at the convention, even though Roosevelt had gotten way more votes, to give the nomination to Taft. Roosevelt has a fit on the convention floor. He freaks out. He starts yelling and screaming, and he gives a big speech. And then like all of his convention delegates, the people that were Roosevelt supporters, they march out and protest. And he says, basically, screw this, screw the Republican Party. If they don't want me and they're going to be corrupt like this, I'm starting my own party, which he actually called the Progressive Party. But we'll get around to it in a second. They got nicknamed in the press the Bull Moose Party. I'll explain that coming up right next. So you would want to write in, though, the 1912 presidential election. Put that in your notes. It's probably the weirdest election cycle in American history, except maybe for this one that we're going through right now. These modern ones, they've gone a little bit off the rails, too. So the 1912 election, a third party comes in that actually has a big following because it's Roosevelt. He is this new party that he started up. And as soon as this election cycle's over, the Bull Moose Party kind of vanishes to history and it goes back to just Republicans and Democrats. But Roosevelt actually has a really good shot of being the first third party candidate in American history to win this election. Now, the Bull Moose story. Well, in part, it got named the Bull Moose Party because Roosevelt was a well-known hunter, and he did shoot a few bull mooses in his day. But the other reason that it got named this was because of Roosevelt's toughness. And I'll say, like, at this point, I love Roosevelt and got a lot of stories to tell about him. This is my all-time favorite story about Roosevelt. So buckle up, listen to this one. He was out campaigning, and like how you would campaign in 1912, you wouldn't run TV ads. There was no TV or radio ads. You wouldn't be on the internet. None of that stuff existed. So you actually had to go do like whistle stops where you'd get on a train and you'd go from town to town to town to town, and you'd stop at every big town, and you would have publicized it ahead of time that like, oh, on the railroad tracks, Roosevelt's train's coming through on Saturday. Go down there to the train station and you can hear Roosevelt from the caboose of the car give a big speech to the people. So he was doing this all around the country. Apparently, one of the stops was in a kind of mid-sized town in Wisconsin. A lot of people came out to hear him talk, like tens of thousands of people out there. They wanted to see Roosevelt. He was their man. They supported him. While he was kind of walking through the crowd, he was actually in a car at the moment, getting up to where he was going to give the speech at. A crazy schizophrenic guy, kind of an echo, a shadow of what had happened with McKinley, comes up to the car and with the revolver shoots Roosevelt in the chest. Now the crowd grabs him. The guy gets arrested. All right. Roosevelt's shot, but he doesn't die right away, but he gets shot with a bullet. He looks at it. He's bleeding. It went through and punctured and, got him. Luckily for him, the bullet shot right in his breast coat pocket where he had his glasses, and he had about 50 pages of notes for his speech that he was going to give. Long speech. Maybe that's why I like him. He's long-winded like me. So the bullet had to go through that, and it was a smaller caliber bullet, and it actually went through all of that, his notes, his glasses, into his chest, and it stopped about a quarter inch away from his heart. Now, at the time, they don't know how deep that bullet has penetrated into him. So everybody, all his aides say, we got to get you to the hospital right away, Mr. President, or former president. We got to get you in. We're going to have surgery. Roosevelt actually says, nah, I don't need the hospital. He coughs a few times to make sure his lungs aren't punctured, because as a hunter, he knows if it's a lung problem, that's going to be trouble. No blood came out. He said, well, I'm not getting out of here. He tried to talk to the guy that shot him and said, why'd you do it? The guy, I guess, was crazy. He was just, you could tell he was gone. He had major psychological problems. So Roosevelt makes his way up to the podium. He gets up in front of the crowd and he says something to the effect of, an assassin tried to chase me away, but I won't let any assassin with his bullets chase me away from giving you fine people your speech today. And then he opens up his coat, and his white shirt underneath is covered with blood. He's bleeding all over himself. And he says, I might screw up my speech a little bit because my notes are all bloody, but I'm going to stay here and I'm going to give you guys the speech I promised you. And he goes on to give an hour-long speech with a bullet in his chest, bleeding all over. And eventually, after about an hour of talking, he gets all pasty and he's getting sweaty and tired. And finally, his aides are like, come on, we got to go. Well, they get him to the hospital. They were going to do an operation and pull it out, but it was too close to the heart. So actually kept that little souvenir for the rest of his life. Now, think about that. Can you imagine Donald Trump or Joe Biden or Barack Obama getting shot and then brushing it off and going and giving an hour speech before one doctor looked at him? Even his worst enemies at this point had to concede and admit, man, he is one tough son of a gun. Whether you loved him or hate him, my God, not many people would do something like that. And ever since hearing that story, that was actually the story I heard that really got me intrigued on Roosevelt, and I started digging into his life a lot more. Now, the election of 1912, check out this little cartoon where I'm going to minimize my face some. You have the elephant, which is the Republican, the donkey, which is the Democrat, and then the big bull moose that's supposed to be Roosevelt. He actually has a good shot at winning. He makes it a good run, but in the end, the Republican Party essentially split their vote between Taft and Roosevelt. Roosevelt did get more votes than Taft, but the Democratic Party, the other main party in the country, actually won a pretty decisive election because the Republican votes had been busted in half. Now, if Roosevelt had been the only one running from the Republican side, he almost certainly would have won. He darn near won. He made a good effort at it, even being a third-party candidate. But really, in American history, that's the closest ever a third-party candidate's ever come to winning the presidency. So he loses. He's bummed out. This gets him depressed. And he goes on with life. Post-presidency. Now, hey, this is 1912, that election. Woodrow Wilson gets sworn in, who Roosevelt does not like. And we'll get into their two stories more later on. But Roosevelt, like he had been critical of Taft, is super critical of Wilson, too. He doesn't like him. They don't see eye to eye. They're just, for a lot of reasons, they don't like each other. About a year after Wilson was sworn in, World War I breaks out in Europe. All right? This massive conflict that's going to restructure the world. Roosevelt strongly felt that America should go intervene and join the war on the side of the Allies. Wilson, his whole thing through his whole first term as president, once the war had begun, was America's going to isolate. We're staying out of it. It's not our fight. Now, you might feel one way or the other, but just know that that was a big point of contention where you had a former president who is pretty popular still, constantly saying, we need to get in this fight. The world is about to change. Let's go help out our allies. And then you have the president saying, I don't think so. This isn't our problem. We're going to butt out of it and let those Europeans just kill each other, and whatever happens, happens. Think about this too. Like, Roosevelt was a warrior. He wanted to go fight. That was one of like the checklist, bucket list things he had in his life, and he got to in the Spanish-American War. Now, his 7 years as president, a lot of stuff happened, but even though Roosevelt was the big warrior, he never once got us involved in any wars. But this wouldn't have been a war he started. It was going to happen either way. All right, we'll get into World War I a little bit more next week and cover that pretty in depth. Roosevelt is beside himself. He always wanted to he felt like it was his destiny to lead this great nation through a time of peril and lead us through a war, that he would have been the ultimate warrior president. Now, history probably would have played out quite a bit differently had Roosevelt won in 1912, because almost certainly America would have gotten into World War I much sooner than it did. Now, we end up joining in the last year of the war, but it's really more towards the tail end when America finally gets involved. Once the war, actually, America does join in the war. So now this is into Woodrow Wilson's second term, and didn't run again in 1916. Roosevelt goes, and now he's almost a 60-year-old man at this time. He goes and asks Wilson. He says, basically, I want to die with my boots on. I don't want to die an old man in my bed. He's like, you know what? Let me go round up a regiment of men like I did with the Rough Riders, and I'll lead them into battle over in the trenches of Europe. Let me go die for my country. He basically says it that way. He promised, I won't return home. He wanted to go die on the battlefield. Wilson is thinks about that a minute. And he's like, my God, I don't think I can do that. For one, you're a former president. And then for two, he's like, what if Roosevelt goes and fights in this war, becomes a war hero, and doesn't die and comes back? He was thinking about down the road. He's like, he will be unstoppable. He would be so popular with the American people at that point, it wouldn't matter if he's a third-party candidate. He's going to get elected anytime he ever wants to. And they're probably right on that. That story would have spun well with the American people and made him totally endearing. Anyway, Wilson says no. Roosevelt gets quite depressed about that. He's bummed out. He wants to go fight. He ends up actually encouraging all of his sons to go fight in the war. So all four of his sons, who I have pictured here, let me move my face a little bit. All four of his sons were World War I and World War II veterans. All right, they all served honorably. We'll get into their stories a little bit more down the road, but his youngest son up here, Quentin, was a fighter pilot in World War I. That's the first war where planes are really used. In the closing months of the war, when America's about to win it, America and the Allies, Quentin gets shot down and killed. When he hears of this totally changes Roosevelt's perspective on warfare and a lot of the tough talk that he had done throughout his life, and he's brokenhearted. He loved his boys. He was a good dad and a good family man. And when his youngest, his baby, Quentin, gets killed over there, it sinks him into one of the worst depressions of his life. And he starts second guessing, man, maybe I shouldn't have told my boys to go fight. On the one hand, he believes in the cause and he believes that it is your duty to fight for your country. On the other hand, he loved Quentin, and now he lost him. And he was the one that had encouraged Quentin to go over and join and to do a dangerous job like being a fighter pilot. After this, he doesn't quite know what he wants to do, but he ends up, remember, anytime he got depressed in his life, he turned to nature. So he and his son Kermit, let me find him here. This is Kermit right here. Go on another safari out into the Amazon rainforest down in Brazil. I guess this safari was not very well planned, and it goes horribly wrong. A lot of the people in the hunting party die. They get attacked by native tribes. They're totally cut off. They run out of supplies. Roosevelt himself gets fever and tells the whole group multiple times, just leave me behind to die. But his son Kermit won't hear of it. He's like, we're taking you along. And Roosevelt, actually, they think he didn't die out there because he knew his son would carry the body. He wouldn't leave him out there in the rainforest, and he knew it's much harder to transport a dead body than somebody that's alive and can do a little bit of movement. They end up getting him out of the rainforest after this horrible safari goes completely wrong, but it took a lot out of him. He lost like 50 pounds of weight. He was emaciated. He got all kinds of bugs and parasites and was quite ill. Anyway, months after returning from that safari, he unexpectedly dies in his sleep of, I believe it was a stroke or a heart attack. And that was the end of TR. Now, interesting guy, an impactful guy. Thank you for bearing with me and listening to my whole spiel on him. The last thing I want to leave you with is Roosevelt, in a lot of ways, is a man of contradictions. Remember how I said that there aren't good guys and bad guys in history? There's nobody that falls totally into one column or the other. Roosevelt's a great example of that. A lot of the views he had back in his times don't really hold up today, all right? But remember, you got to judge people by the times in which they lived. And Roosevelt was a pretty progressive and I think a darn good president for the era he was alive. Now, how would he be today as president? Who knows? Your guess is as good as mine. My hunch is some of you said really he'd be a good one and we need a guy like him. Others said not so much for one reason or another. I tend to think he would be a good president today because I think he was a smart guy that was adaptable. And one of the things I respect absolutely most about him, and I'd want you to put this in your notes too, he changed his views throughout life. He actually changed and became more progressive as his presidency and his life went on. And I think anybody that just like thinks, oh, maybe at the time they're 15 or 20 or 25, I believe in this view, and you just are stubborn and never will change your view just because you're not going to change and admit you were wrong at one time, I don't respect that trait much at all. I think when new evidence and new facts come out and you have more experiences, it's good to change your opinion if that's called for, all right? And Roosevelt was great at that. So here's a few other things that I'll leave you with, and then we'll be done and wrap it up here. Roosevelt, I said, is a man of contradictions. What I mean by that, listen to these. He was born a rich man. He never had to work a day in his life. He was super wealthy, yet he was a champion of common workers and called a class traitor because he turned against a lot of those really wealthy, powerful monopolist guys and industrialists. So, born a rich guy, yet he defended poor people a lot. He was a warrior. He'd always talked about fighting, warrior, wanted to go fight in the Spanish-American War. He, in a lot of ways, was very bloodthirsty. Yet, when he was president for 7 years, he didn't start one conflict. He kept America out of wars, and in fact, he actually brokered numerous peace treaties. So he actually went around and ended wars in other places around the world. So he's a warrior, but yet he starts no wars and really participated as president, got the country into no conflicts. So he's a warrior, yet a peacemaker. He was kind of a racist, remember? He said a lot of quotes about how the white race he thought was dominant and the most superior race on planet Earth, yet he was the first president to have a black guy to the White House to actually eat with him and sit down and get to know him. He also was the first president to appoint a lot of black men to different federal jobs. And he was very much, even though he would say things that were kind of racist, for sure racist by today's standards, he also always said, I judge everybody as an individual. And I think that there are exceptional, smart, strong, brave people that come in every race and color. So he would also, like, on the one hand, he kind of had that racism tent. On the other hand, he judged people as individuals. And he actually genuinely had friends of other races, blacks, Native Americans, and Asians. Again, kind of a contradictory mindset there. He was a hunter, all right? And he was all about going out and using nature for his own benefit. Yet also, he was a conservationist. He was the president that started the national park system and set aside millions of acres of land to be preserved for future generations. I don't know. He's an interesting guy, to say the least. At least that's Chaluky's biased opinion. All right. Thank you for bearing with me. That's the last part of this series. Sorry I got a little bit long with it, but I had a lot of good stuff to tell you. All right. Take care.